This is a podcast from Duncan, Cartlidge Online, the online resource for all construction professionals that's available 24/7. Don't forget to subscribe at the point where you usually get your podcasts so as not to miss a thing. Hello again, and welcome to another podcast from Duncan, Cartlidge Online. I hope you've managed to slip back into work mode after the festive break. You'll be pleased to hear that Barney has fully recovered from the excesses of the past few weeks, and as usual, is here with me. Snow arrived as we recorded this, so he's doubly happy. In this episode, we'll continue to concentrate on JCT 16 and contract administration and look at instructions and their importance in the JCT suite of contracts, interim payments, what can be included, and the final account, layout and timing. Incidentally, all the above topics and more are the subject of videos on Duncan Cartlidge Online and can be accessed for a modest monthly subscription equivalent to the couple of flat whites. So, let's get started with a look at instructions. And I hate to sound boring, but accurate record keeping is essential when managing instructions, as it is with all aspects of contract administration. JCT standard forms now have a common layout, and instructions are included in Section 3, Control of the Works. I think of instructions as making the post-contract world go round, and are needed for items ranging from variations, see podcast number 6, and postponement of the works, to action to be taken in the event of discovering antiquities. Instructions also play a large part when drawing up the final account, as discussed later in this podcast, and the formulation of any loss and expense claims, to be discussed in a future podcast, so keep an eye open for that. Items included in the variation and final account should contain a clear indication of the instruction that the item refers to. Without it, the item is not valid and should not be considered or paid. Although JCT 16 contains very prescriptive terms for the issue and compliance of instructions, and these will be discussed shortly, a certain amount of trust and give and take is necessary to make the system work smoothly. In my experience, it is not uncommon at the end of a project for the contractor to hand the contract administrator a list of items that have been discussed and carried out, but are without the necessary instructions for them to be included in the final account. This attitude demonstrates a good working relationship. It does sometimes, though, make the preparation of the final account more difficult. The vast majority of instructions will be in the form of variations, and these may be issued by the contract administrator or, if there is one, the clerk of works, although instructions issued by the clerk of works have to be confirmed by the contract administrator within 2 working days, although my earlier comment regarding an element of give and take comes into play again. During site visits, the contract administrator often issues verbal instructions. These instructions should be confirmed within 7 days by either the contract administrator or the contractor. Unless the contractor objects to the instruction, the work has, in the words of the contract, to be carried out forthwith. If the contractor fails to get on with the work covered by an instruction, verbal or written, by the contract administrator has the authority to employ another contractor to carry out the work and contracharge the contractor. But in my experience, this very seldom happens, and let's face it, if it was necessary, it would be a very negative move and symptomatic of a serious breakdown of working relationships. Other circumstances where instructions are needed are for the adjustment of provisional sums and items, provisional quantities, approximate quantities, and the inspection of work covered up. For those who have a subscription account, there is an example layout of a final account under the Resources tab on Duncan Cartlidge Online website, and this includes a statement of adjustment of provisional sums and items. If you don't have a subscription, it's only £7 a month and cancelable at any time, if cancelable is a word. Hang on, I'll just ask Barney. He's nodding, so it must be right. Just to remind you that provisional sums can be either defined or undefined. The difference being that a defined sum, when adjusted, does not allow the contractor the grounds for additional costs for disruption, etc., whereas an undefined provisional sum can give grounds for additional costs when adjusted if justified. The decision on whether provisional sums are defined or undefined is purely arbitrary and is taken by the quantity surveyor when preparing the bill of quantities or work package. The bill should contain a separate list of defined and undefined provisional sums, and I've never known a contractor challenge the classification. Provisional sums classified as defined will transfer risk to the contractor, whereas undefined provisional sums have the opposite effect. Although the classification of provisional sums may seem insignificant, if the contract documents contain a substantial number, they should be evaluated to assess the risk. Now let's have a look at inspection of the works that have been covered up. If the contract administrator suspects the works that have been completed and subsequently covered up are defective, an instruction can be issued to uncover the work. It's a bit like a game of poker. If the contract administrator calls the contractor's bluff and the work is found to be defective, the contractor pays for the cost of rectifying the defect. However, if the work is not defective, the contract administrator ends up with egg on their face and the client must pay. And while we're on dodgy workmanship, if a contractor includes materials of a lesser or different specification and cost to the items specified in the contract documents, if the client agrees to accept the substituted materials, they can remain, and a reduction in cost agreed, which to me sounds extremely sensible. Now let's have a look at interim payments. As we all know and appreciate, cash flow is the lifeblood of contracting and subcontracting, and for this reason, getting fully reimbursed on time for work and materials on and off-site is vitally important. Poor management of cash flow is one of the main reasons for the high level of construction companies falling into receivership. Therefore, the preparation of applications for payment on account should be a primary focus. It should be remembered that even though items are included and paid for in an interim payment, they can still subsequently be condemned by the contract administrator and required to be replaced or removed. It's unusual in the UK for contractors to receive advance payments, in other words, money up front. When I worked in Paris, I was shocked to see even contractors of the status of the mighty Bouygues receive advance payments in their first interim certificate. My first reaction was, hello, something underhand is going on here, and considered whether I should blow the whistle. Of course, Bouygues may have had a bond in place to cover the advance. It was just strange to see a contractor of their stature asking for an advance. At the same time, I checked their application for payments and queried one or two items. I thought these were out of place. I soon learned that in France, you don't do this, as all hell broke loose when Bouygues found out what I was trying to do. Over the years, two pernicious practices have been commonplace in the construction industry. The first is the practice of pay when paid, when a Tier 1 contractor refuses to pay subcontractors until they have been paid. Of course, the subcontractors have no way of knowing when the Tier 1 contractor has been paid, as they have no contract with the client, and the Tier 1 contractor can hang on to payments for weeks or even months to improve their own cash flow before paying, and the further down the supply chain you are, the longer it takes. The second dubious practice is for clients to deduct money from interim payments recommended by the contract administrator without first informing the contractor. Legislation was introduced to try to curb these practices, but 13 years after the Local Democracy, Economic Development and Construction Acts became effective, Tier 1 contractors still impose 60 days plus payment terms. The practice of clients withholding money has improved insofar that a pay less notice now has to be issued, giving reasons for the action. In a recent blog on Duncan Cartlidge Online, I discussed the government's proposals that contractors bidding for public sector work must demonstrate that they pay a significant percentage of subcontractors promptly in order to be included on tender lists. There have been similar schemes in the past, and the major contractors seem to drift in and out of compliance as their payment regime alters. Remember, interim payments are an estimate, but should be as accurate as possible. Overpayments should be avoided, as it's very difficult to claw back money from a contractor that has gone into receivership. On the other hand, underpayment may cause cash flow problems for the contractor or subcontractor. When using JCT 16, what items can a contractor include in their interim payment applications, assuming a bill of quantities is being used? Preliminaries is generally the first item. The contractor should have submitted a detailed breakdown of preliminaries on or before acceptance of their tender, which should be checked as part of the due diligence, and payment is made in accordance with this breakdown. Properly executed measured works will be the largest part of the valuation and is an estimate of the completed works. This is where the much maligned bill of quantities comes into its own, as an agreed percentage of the pricing of the measured works can be agreed and included. In my experience, trade-by-trade bills are better for this than elemental bills. The value of agreed variations issued in accordance with the contract may also be included in an interim certificate. Now we come to materials on and off site. Materials on site are generally not a problem, as a visual inspection can usually establish whether the amounts included by the contractor are reasonable. The only thing to watch is if materials are included months ahead of their inclusion in the work, and these should not be paid for until nearer the time they are needed and removed from the valuation. Materials off-site can be more problematic and can include items that may be damaged or deteriorated if stored on site. In order for materials off-site to be included, the contractor must supply proof that they own the items, that they are insured for the full value, and they are clearly marked and set aside in a safe place. If necessary, the contractor may be required to take out a bond to cover the cost for any loss or damage. Note the position is somewhat different in Scotland. Other items included in the interim certificate are fluctuations, if appropriate, and finally, any agreed loss and expense claims may be included too. From the above, retention is deducted except for claims and fluctuations, and then finally, previous payments are deducted to arrive at the interim payment. If payment is not received by the contractor within 14 days, they may suspend work and charge interest on late payments at 5% above base rate. But of course, this seldom happens, as in reality, suspending work will be the kiss of death to the contractor ever receiving any monies. And one last point, if the contract administrator fails to make an interim payment, the contractor can apply directly to the employer. And finally in this podcast, let's look at the final account. The final account does what it says on the tin. It is the agreed final bill for the project. For some reason, drawing up the final account has been seen as not a very glamorous task. Nevertheless, someone has to do it. In the past, I have been employed by a large London borough, that shall remain nameless, to complete final accounts on projects that finished years before my involvement. Because the client was in the public sector, it was necessary to establish an audit trail to justify the cost of the hundreds of variations and other changes that had been issued, but for whatever reason had not been measured. The problem with this approach is, as they say in the Westerns, the trail has gone cold. Personnel have left the organisation, and all that is left is a pile of documents and drawings, but no final account. It makes the process so much more expensive and time-consuming and open to dispute, as no one can remember what happened and why instructions were issued. So my advice is, don't wait until the job is nearing completion before thinking about the final account. Prepare it while the work is being carried out, which I realise may be easier said than done. Well, that's all for this episode. I hope that you found it useful. This has been a podcast from Duncan, Cartlidge Online. Thank you for listening, and from Barney and me, until next time, bye for now.